So let's continue with our forecast on the budget speech to be delivered by the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni tomorrow afternoon. We've been asking you to share your expectations and to share her insights is Senior Research Fellow, Trade Collective think tank, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for joining us. Now, earlier on, Francis spoke about the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is what I think a lot of us have been wondering about. Most importantly, what is the model that in Africa in general that we are looking to when we are embarking on these exercises?
There are quite a number that we can choose from. So a Sovereign Wealth Fund in brief is basically a mechanism that a state will use in order to free up some money for infrastructural or social development. And one could argue that, of course, we've got several existing platforms in this regard in this country. And typically it comes from a state fiscus, especially surplus, so budget surpluses, which unfortunately we in South Africa are battling a bit with. But it also is another way of generating resources for that would be from mineral wealth. Some people here have suggested mining royalties, that kind of thing. And also from, the oil-rich countries, of course, find it quite easy, where these originate from, your Dubais, your United Arab Emirates, your Kuwaits, your Abu Dhabis, and so forth. Libya as well as a notable example. But also Zambia has a sovereign wealth fund, which they've been doing quite useful things with over the last few years.
And we've also seen discussions like that in Botswana as well. Yes. What can we learn from that? I
mean, I think the one thing is transparent governance and really stable, consistent governance of mineral resources, if that's the route that we're going to use to galvanize and fundraise for it. And I think that it takes a huge level of public trust in systems, including tax collection. So another way in which sovereign wealth funds are motivated through taxes, right? So increasing tax collection, but also ensuring that there is a consistent and a very efficient way of collecting what has been used, and ensuring, of course, public trust. Again, in this country at the moment, we're battling a bit with that, given some of what has happened over the last couple of years with the SARS commissioner, and we need to realize that our governance structure is linked to our capacity to mobilize public sentiment for something like a sovereign wealth fund. Of course, notwithstanding that, we're also waiting for the arrival of the infrastructure fund, which, to my mind, which was worth about, we were waiting for about 100 billion rand, which is supposed to catalyze different public sector projects and public investment and public development projects. And I think it's been about 18 months and counting. We haven't seen any sign of that. So it seems as though we're either moving the goalposts or shifting names of things around. There's also an argument which says that we could probably use an existing instrument, and we've got several, a plethora of financial development institutions in this country, at provincial level and nationally, that perhaps we could just expand the scope of any one of them.
Let's explore that a little bit later. But you mentioned a very important thing about transparency, and the most important thing, I think I'd make the assumption that a lot of that money is then invested offshore. So you also mentioned the deficit trust that we're experiencing because of things such as state capture. So how are we to know exactly how the money is going to be divvied up, where it's going to come from, especially if we're suffering from low growth and shortage in very specific and strategic areas for our economy?
Yeah, so we don't have the budget surplus, and in fact a lot of the sovereign wealth funds are instruments that have been used to put as petty cash for countries which do have a budget surplus, for them to then see how they can futuristically begin to plan for a country's growth. And secondly, we don't currently right now have much of public trust, and I think that the Zondo Commission has illustrated the many foibles that we have in our governance. And lastly, I think we also have not been very efficient in the way that we manage our current tax base. We also have a very low tax base. That's the other thing. We're moving from a low tax base in this country currently, and I'm not sure whether we've been able to give a sense. I think I'd be interested in what Minister Mboweni is going to say tomorrow, to give a sense in which there's a much more finite direction in this regard, and in resolving a lot of the hangovers that have emerged from the previous SARS commissioner.
And there are those who are even speculating that, given our circumstances, he definitely will resist the urge to at least increase the tax base, especially for big corporates, but there is a temptation perhaps to increase VAT.
And I think that that's actually counter-logical. That's quite counterintuitive, because that's a very corporatist approach, isn't it? So one would argue that actually corporates are the ones who need to pay a bit more because they have a bit more at their disposal. whilst we already have multiple taxes that we're paying. We pay taxes on fuel. We're paying invisible taxes due to the energy and fuel shortage at the moment, especially the ESCOM crisis, which has cost us quite a lot of productivity already. I mean, some guesstimates put it at about R1 billion per day. So that, of course, in terms of manufacturing and other forms of production across this country, is already an invisible tax that we're all going to pay the penalty for at some stage. So I actually think that the notion of us digging deeper into our pockets as ordinary citizens and consumers is counterintuitive.
So, as you mentioned, there are myriad ways in which we can approach this. So if we were to talk about the size of the fund, what would dictate that, especially including the domestic investment mandate? Where would we get that from, especially the competing priorities that we have?
This is why I really think that we need to think about either renaming this or reframing this, or building on existing infrastructure. That we've got social development and infrastructural funds in this country, whether it's for people in business, whether it's for different forms of physical and intangible infrastructure, your GBSAs, your IDCs, your NEFs, and so on and so forth. And again, some countries do it as part of a centralized reserve bank mandate. Others do it as a private bank, which is to the slightly adjacent to state control, but not entirely. So with a private board overseen by the state. So I think we also have to be very careful because of the huge amount of cadre deployment that we've seen over the last few years, and really that as being part of the reason that existing state-owned enterprises may have said have not been run very well, quite frankly, we would have to be very careful that this doesn't become yet another thing to be mismanaged, or yet another thing that might lose public credibility.
What would be the best ethos? As you said, it's a kitty fund of sorts. Do you, in tandem, also partner up with other development financial institutions?
That's one model. Another model would be that it could be an investment in partnership with private investors. I'm always, again, quite wary of that, because what potentially these can also become is basically behave like your ordinary hedge funds, which speculate all over the world, quite frankly, and are no longer national sovereign funds. And one example of this, which I've mentioned in a previous interview, is that sovereign wealth funds helped to bail out your Merrill Lynch's post-2008 after, the U.S., the Wall Street meltdown, which, of course, the rest of us had to deal with. And I think that one would argue that a sovereign wealth fund is not an instrument for bailing out private corporations who have been reckless and irresponsible. It should be for building roads to Lisikisiki and ensuring that the whole of South Africa has Wi-Fi, and that there are public libraries, and that children are able to have school buildings in safe environments which are stimulating and so on, and all of those things.
Including quality sanitation.
That's right.
All right, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us, Ms. Lebohang Pheko. She is she's Senior Research Fellow at the Trade Collective think tank. And Aldrin, it's back to you.